Hot dogs are radioactive, buildings are radioactive, water is radioactive, bananas are radioactive. Everything is radioactive. In fact, it's estimated that the average American receives 0.00 decibels of radiation per year from food. But even though we're constantly bombarded with this natural radiation, only one food stands out as being particularly radioactive: bananas. So why are they radioactive? Well, in this video I am going to show you the real reason and how much radiation you need to be exposed to before it becomes dangerous. To start, let's take a look at what's inside a banana. Potassium is the 7th most abundant element on Earth, but there are actually 3 different kinds of potassium that all have slightly different properties. First, there's potassium 39, which is stable and non-radioactive. Then there's potassium 40, which is radioactive and makes up about 1.5% of all potassium found in nature. Finally, there's potassium 41, which is also radioactive but occurs in extremely tiny quantities. Because potassium 39 is the most abundant form of potassium, you might assume that it would be the easiest to come by, and normally it is. But unfortunately, it's also an incredibly difficult element to separate from other elements. In fact, some estimates say that it would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to produce just 1 gram of pure potassium 39, which means it's nearly impossible for humans to obtain large quantities of this element. Instead, our only source of potassium 39 is food, meaning that if you wanted to avoid any radioactive decay, you'd have to cut yourself off from pretty much every fruit and vegetable on the planet. Potassium 41, on the other hand, is really easy to separate from other elements. But the problem is that it's produced artificially using nuclear reactors. And because it's been used in so few nuclear weapons, it's barely present in the environment. So really the only radioactive potassium that you have to worry about is potassium 40, which is found naturally in foods like bananas. But what does potassium 40 do? Well, it's radioactive, meaning that its nucleus is unstable and will eventually break apart. This process of breaking apart is called radioactive decay, and when it happens, potassium 40 turns into either argon 40 or calcium 40. Calcium 40 is stable, so no further decay is possible. But argon 40 is radioactive and will eventually turn into potassium 40 again, creating a repeating cycle of decay. In fact, this cycle is happening right now within your body. That's because potassium 40 is naturally present in many foods like bananas. And since potassium 40 decays into argon 40 at a rate of 1.25 decays per second, you're constantly being bombarded by radiation coming from your own cells. Luckily, potassium 40 has a half-life of over 1 billion years, meaning that it won't disappear anytime soon. And since you eat bananas every day, you'll constantly replenish the supply of potassium 40 inside your body. But does this mean that eating bananas is dangerous? After all, if you're being bombarded by radiation constantly, wouldn't it be better to avoid the source altogether? Well, yes, it would. But the thing to keep in mind here is that potassium 40 is everywhere. And since it takes 1.25 disintegrations per second to decay, a single banana doesn't have enough potassium 40 to make you sick. In fact, you'd need about 100,000 bananas a day to receive a lethal dose of radiation. That's why the amount of radiation we get from certain foods is always compared to bananas. For instance, hot dogs are about 6 times more radioactive than bananas, while granite countertops can range anywhere from 20 to 100 times more radioactive. But why are these things radioactive? Well, it all comes down to where they get their potassium from. For instance, hot dogs get their potassium from, well, everything. Since pigs are omnivores that eat lots of plants, granite, on the other hand, gets its potassium from rocks and soil, which also contains traces of uranium. Uranium, after all, is the heaviest element on the periodic table and makes up the Earth's core. As such, it's closely related to thorium, which is often found alongside uranium and is also radioactive. Thorium, however, isn't as infamous as uranium since it doesn't split as easily. Instead, it tends to capture neutrons and turn into uranium-133, which can then split and release energy. This process of capturing neutrons and releasing energy is what nuclear reactors use to generate power. In fact, almost all of the world's nuclear reactors run on thorium. So if we ever hope to replace fossil fuels with nuclear energy, it'll be important that we find a way to safely dispose of thorium-133. But regardless of whether or not you think nuclear energy is dangerous, it's clear that rocks, soil, and water will always contain trace amounts of radioactive materials like thorium and uranium. And if those things end up in your food, it'll also become radioactive. Even the water you drink will contain small amounts of radioactive elements like radium, radon, and thorium. In fact, you can even detect this radiation by purchasing special Geiger counters online. Just search for thorium or radon detectors and you'll see a bunch of options pop up. Now, when people find out that their homes are radioactive, they're usually pretty worried. But studies show that the extra radiation isn't dangerous, unless it's in extremely high concentrations. For instance, people living in Brazil who drank contaminated water every day only received 0.1 millisieverts of extra radiation each year, which is around 5% of the normal background radiation they receive from cosmic rays and other sources. The same thing goes for homes built from granite countertops, which may seem alarming, but are actually safe to live in. In fact, you do need to spend 8 hours a day touching the counter for a full year to receive a lethal dose of radiation. It's the same thing with bananas. If you ate a bunch of them every day, you could probably get sick, but only if you ate a ridiculous number of them. For instance, one study found that a pregnant woman would have to eat 700 bananas a day for 100 years to increase her chances of cancer by just 2%. Another study came to the conclusion that you do have to eat 1,000 bananas a day for 100 years to increase your chances of cancer by 5%. To put this into perspective, it is also worth noting that the average American consumes just 0.00 millisieverts of radiation each year from all sources. Meanwhile, you receive about 0.02 millisieverts of radiation just from getting a dental X-ray. So really, we're surrounded by radiation all the time, and we don't even notice. It is actually such a common occurrence that scientists have developed a unit to measure how much radiation we get from certain sources. This unit is called the banana equivalent dose, or BED, and it's exactly what it sounds like. One BED is equal to the amount of radiation you'd get from eating one banana. Since one banana contains about 400 becquerels of potassium-40, one BED is also equal to 400 becquerels. Now, it may seem kind of weird to talk about bananas and radiation in the same sentence, but by using the banana equivalent dose, scientists are able to compare radiation levels in a much easier to understand way. For instance, the average granite countertop contains about 3,300 becquerels of radiation, meaning that it's about 8.3 beds. That's why it's always important to remember where certain elements come from, because by understanding the origin of everyday objects, we can often put our minds at ease knowing that, even if something is radioactive, it's probably safe in small doses. Bananas, for instance, are radioactive because they contain potassium-40, which decays into argon-40 at a rate of 1.5 atoms per second. But the good news is that eating 100,000 bananas a day won't kill you. However, if you want to learn more about the dangers of nuclear waste, stay tuned for more information. Thanks for watching.